Hello, KubeCon. My name is Kathleen Juell, and I'm a developer at DigitalOcean. I work on the digital experience team, which is the team that powers DigitalOcean's community site, among other web properties. So I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about effective Kubernetes onboarding. Some of you may be familiar with the community platform already. We have a wide range of tutorials, questions, answers, and developer tools that are designed to spread awareness and knowledge of open source technologies. So I'll just say a quick word here to plug our community writing program in case anyone wants to share any of the great things that you're working on with the DigitalOcean community. We do accept submissions from community external authors, so please definitely feel free to get in touch with me if you want to learn more about that. So why am I here today? In this talk, I want to take you through some of the lessons that the community team has learned from both a content and a development perspective about effective Kubernetes onboarding. So the goal is to give you some actionable tips that you can hopefully use the next time that you need to get yourself and/or your team up to speed with Kubernetes. So how did we come to these insights, you might ask? Well, as many of you are aware, DigitalOcean has a managed Kubernetes product, which was made generally available in May of 2019. So leading up to and following the release of that product, the core contributors on the community content team were tasked with the following project: teach the world Kubernetes. So the push to develop content began. And here in the screenshot, you can see one outgrowth of that push for content, which is our Kubernetes for Full Stack Developers curriculum, which I'm going to discuss in more detail later. So, teach the world Kubernetes. Seems like a straightforward ask, right? Except, where do you begin? The team was definitely going to need some operating principles to build out that content. Otherwise, and I definitely would not recommend this approach, the team would just be creating content using a kind of scattershot approach, hoping to cover all relevant bases by some kind of happy accident. So let me cut right to the chase and tell you about the approach and the principles that the team evolved in order to teach the world Kubernetes. First, know your audience and their objectives. Second, determine the best approach to meet those objectives. And finally, scope your approach appropriately. So I'll have more to say about each of these in turn. Meanwhile, back on the community platform itself, a set of related questions and issues were arising. Basically, we were in the process of moving our staging and production pipelines and environments to our internal Kubernetes clusters. Prior to this transition, we had been relying on some trusty, reliable, but ultimately outdated Ubuntu servers. Like the 97 Corolla that I drove until a few years ago, these servers had brought us far, but it was time to make the change. So the principles that I want to discuss for onboarding teams and individuals to Kubernetes also stem from the work that the community development team was doing on the platform side. Community is a Rails application, and it was staffed by a group of developers with web development backgrounds who were used to deploying in more traditional VM environments. So deploying to Kubernetes meant involving the entire team in decision-making conversations around the changes, consequences, and trade-offs of using this new architecture. So in working through these principles with you, I'm going to combine insights from both the content and the development side, as I had the good fortune of both contributing content to the Kubernetes curriculum and also working on the development team that finalized community's transition to Kubernetes. All right, so first, when you're getting anyone up to speed with Kubernetes, or really any other new topic, the first question you want to ask is, who are you dealing with? Maybe you're onboarding application developers. This group wants to be able to accomplish their day-to-day tasks and deliver on set expectations. So they need to know enough about how their application environment is going to change in order to make the best and most informed decisions in their day-to-day work. So one example here out of many would be something like a cron job. Cron jobs work one way on a VM, but in a distributed environment, they need to be handled differently. So it's good for whoever's working on features that expect those jobs to be running to be informed about any relevant changes. Members of this group also need to be able to deploy, or if they're not doing that themselves, they need to be able to get things up to a point where deployment can happen. So for our team, deployment on Kubernetes would mean would be a process that involved different processes from what we had been using on VMs, so no more Capybara, for example. So we needed to bring people up to speed on how moving to Kubernetes would affect the deploy process. Maybe in your case, you're onboarding operators, or maybe your audience includes people who are going to function in this capacity. Like developers, this group is going to need to know the processes, procedures, and tools that relate to deployment. However, they are also likely going to be charged with things like automation, managing CI, scheduling backups, and other related tasks. It's also very likely that they're going to be asked to implement logging, monitoring, and alerting. So information that's tailored for this group will likely cover somewhat different topics than information that's tailored for application developers. Another possibility, maybe you're onboarding decision makers or other stakeholders. These could be the folks, for example, who are in the position to approve the headcount that you need to accelerate your development on Kubernetes. So information for this group will then be tailored around things like making financial decisions and really understanding the tech as it rolls up to top-level business goals. They also need to see how and where team growth and development fit into longer-term objectives for the business. So with these ideas in mind, let's go back to the Kubernetes curriculum for a moment. Thinking about these groups as I've just described them ended up being central to how the content team organized their content, which consisted of new tutorials that were written specifically for this curriculum, as well as existing content that the team wanted to organize and present in a meaningful and different way. At first, the team considered using different tracks, only presenting material to certain members of certain groups. But ultimately, they decided that that was somewhat limiting, so they opted for more of a choose-your-own-adventure style of approach to presenting the material. So tutorials were organized in such a way that users could select what was most relevant for them based on, the expectations of their role at that time. And though they didn't include it in the curriculum, they did publish a white paper that was addressed specifically to business stakeholders to provide a kind of bird's eye view of Kubernetes and its benefits. Okay, so once you know who you are addressing, what approach should you take to onboarding them? If your audience includes application developers who need to develop with a distributed architecture in mind and deploy successfully, then you might cover the following topics as a way of establishing some theoretical foundations, as well as what's needed to accomplish specific practical tasks. So first, it might be a good idea to cover some 12FA principles for things like versioning, dependencies, configuration, state, and so on. Environment variables are a good example here, making sure that everyone understands what to refactor, who holds the keys for updating these variables wherever they live, and things like that. So in our case, that's in Vault. So you want to know who has access to that. It might also be good to cover some modernizing topics, things like health and readiness checks, logging, monitoring, and so on. So even in the case where logging and monitoring are handled by other teams, application developers could still be responsible for things like making sure health and/or readiness endpoints exist. So understanding the need for those is important. Next, containers. What do they mean for your application? One way of covering this in practical terms could be setting up a local development environment with Docker and Compose to get folks familiar with what goes into an image and how the containerized stack behaves as a whole. So for example, the community application sits behind Nginx. Having a local setup that replicated the deployed stack was really handy as an illustrative tool and got the team more familiar with the entire setup. Finally, you want to make sure that whoever is deploying knows what's required for that process to be successful. So who is pressing the button, what's the button that needs to be pressed, and what should folks do in cases of failures or necessary rollbacks. So it might seem straightforward to say that you're just going to cover all these topics. However, blockers might arise for your team as they process this information and look at what's required of them to get up to speed with the proposed changes. So ostensibly, your team is spending work hours on this transition, so you want to help them avoid any blockers. So one blocker could be something like, well, why is this necessary? Why are we doing this now? What are the foundational components of a distributed architecture? What does that really mean? How do containers differ from VMs? What does that mean for me? And then finally, what are the differences in the tools and systems that I'm used to? Am I going to have access to those things? Is using them going to be different? And so on. So depending on where your developers are coming from and what their experiences are, it may be helpful to think about covering some meta-level topics in your onboarding process. Ultimately, doing this can involve the team more closely in the decision-making process, since a meta-level understanding of the architecture will allow them to extrapolate out and actually get out ahead of problems that could arise in their own area of expertise. So one helpful way to approach this might be to separate out larger topics like what is Kubernetes, what are containers, what are components of a distributed architecture, from what I'm going to call operational topics, like how do I extract my application configuration? How do I ensure that the app is stateless, and so on. Again, it's really important to understand the needs of your group here, what they have experience with, and what they are trying to accomplish. So for the Kubernetes curriculum, for example, the team decided to address the need for a meta-level overview by having an introductory topics section that readers could opt into if they wanted. So this section covered things like basic system architecture, core objects, and other key foundational topics. So since the audience for the curriculum was theoretically everyone, the team thought this made the most sense. They assumed that this could be helpful for many people, but it wasn't necessarily reading for everyone. So it made sense to include it as optional and for everyone, for folks who were new, and then also folks who wanted a refresher. Meanwhile, back on the community platform team, we were giving regular updates on our progress as we conducted testing for our production rollover, though we did break some of the decision-making discussions into smaller stand-ups for the core folks who were involved in the infrastructure work. We also created some internal documentation to give a kind of high-level overview of where information was now going to be located in the application. So things like deployment manifests and pipelines for concourse. We also created detailed guides on how to deploy to staging and production, as well as how to roll back and redeploy and troubleshoot. So overall, we were focused on taking what I would call a highly operational approach to information sharing. Some of the topics that we focused on making sure everyone understood as we moved towards the final rollover included things like understanding where secrets were located, having a baseline understanding of what was going into the application and server images, a basic understanding of how to troubleshoot concourse, and then of course how to kick off and roll back deployments. However, it turns out that we had failed to cover some of the kind of meta-level nuances of what it meant to just deploy in a distributed architecture. So we saw this most clearly when we were in our initial thinking about scheduled jobs, which changed over the course of our discussions as we talked through the anticipated architecture in more detail. So once everyone was on the same page with the higher level structure of our new architecture, we were able to come up with a solution to ensure that our scheduled jobs ran as expected between our two clusters. Some of the key learnings that we took away from this were, it's definitely okay to break folks out in terms of operational responsibilities. So having a dedicated group dealing with infrastructure in a granular way, for example. It's also perfectly fine to organize information around operational goals, things like app development, deployment, and so on. However, it can also be a really good idea to sync on meta-level changes to make sure that everyone is on the same page. And in retrospect, reflecting on this process, I would recommend doing that at the beginning of a transition process, like the one I'm describing. All right, so the last thing I want to touch on today is scope. Once you know who you're dealing with and what their objectives are, as well as the approach that you're going to take to meet these objectives, so either a meta-level approach or an operational one or some combination of the two, then you're going to want to think about how to scope the communication process itself. So there are various formats that you could consider here. Docs are a great way, for example, to communicate information asynchronously. They also offer a great way of creating self-selecting pathways through a body of material, which can be super handy if you have a lot to cover. So for example, the Kubernetes curriculum offers a topical and self-selected path through a lot of different tutorials. And as I mentioned, each cluster of tutorials in a section of the curriculum rolls up to a particular audience, developers, operators, with topics that pertain to the goals that these users might have. So in this way, the team is hoping to make it easier for folks to navigate this content in a way that would be meaningful and helpful for them. Similarly, the Kubernetes docs themselves offer a self-selecting pathway where readers can find information on core concepts, as well as information on particular operational tasks. So another way that you can actually incrementally expand the scope of your documentation without changing your approach, if in fact you are taking an operational approach, is what I like to think of as the unique feature of DigitalOcean's technical tutorials. So these are small, often a positive phrase level explanations of particular tools, technologies, or concepts. They're relatively cheap to include in terms of the space and effort required, but they can really integrate a meta-level coverage of topics into what are otherwise operational discussions. So basically, a good rule of thumb here, if you're trying to approach your docs this way, is when in doubt, define it. Another great format for onboarding is a recorded talk. So at DigitalOcean, we do a Munch and Learn series every Wednesday with topics like Ceph 101, writing Kubernetes controllers, and concourse best practices, and more. So these are really great ways to scope a topic down and focus it on developers and operators. They're also really valuable resources to help foster company-wide best practices. Finally, though I hesitate strongly suggesting adding meetings to anyone's calendar, when approached strategically, they can really be a great time saver. Speaking from our experience on Community, I would say that it's handy to have an agenda for these meetings, particularly if you're getting people acquainted with Kubernetes for the first time. So even a few minutes spent at the top of a meeting doing a kind of high-level architectural overview can save you a lot of time down the road. Also, your approach doesn't need to be one of these things, right? In general, I would say, though, as you move through these different formats, your scope will inevitably narrow. So talks vary, of course, but in the format that I'm describing, which is a kind of like quick half-hour onboarding session to a particular topic, you're going to want to limit your scope by dint of necessity, making sure that your topic is something that you could cover in a half an hour for a fairly well-defined audience. However, finally, in meetings, you're going to be speaking presumably to a group of people who share your context, so you're probably going to be highly specific. However, you can make more assumptions in a meeting like that about shared knowledge and context, since you're speaking to your teammates and colleagues. On Community, I would say we took a kind of composite approach, combining focused meetings and internal documentation, as well as sharing some video resources from that Munch and Learn series that I mentioned earlier. We also created a local Docker environment to look at how the stack behaves locally. In retrospect, I would say that the team has adapted really well to the change in environment. Everyone knows what they need to get their job done, and they're getting it done. People also feel really positively about the move to Kubernetes, since, for an application that serves about 4 million visitors a month, Kubernetes definitely gives us security in scale, among many other things. Did we make everyone a Kubernetes power user? I would say no. But we didn't really feel that that was the requirement. Instead, we really wanted folks to feel empowered to do their best work and to be able to extrapolate out into their work what, a kind of basic understanding of our new architecture, so they could basically inform their work with that understanding. So that's what we aimed for. I would say that is what we accomplished. Okay, so that's it for me today. Happy to take any questions in the Q&A here, and thank you all very much for coming. All right, welcome to Q&A. For folks who are asking about the slides, I apologize, they are on the schedule. I haven't been able to send any replies here, so I'm gonna be doing that verbally. We do have a link out to the slides in the community channel in the KubeCon Slack, and they are on the schedule. They have been uploaded there, but that link also, that direct link is in the community Slack channel. So yeah. Vitor asks, any surprising issues you found through the process? Thanks for the talk. So, yeah, I mean, I think I was a little surprised by, and maybe this is not something I should have been surprised about given the journey I've described, but, it's easy to lose sight of the basics when you're sort of already well versed. So I think that moment that I described where we were like, oh, we need to pull back and have like a meta level discussion of some like Kubernetes core concepts before we kind of like move forward with the rest of this process was a bit of a surprise. And that's why I wanted to like highlight that here because, it's something that, might not be intuitive or obvious that you'd need to like take that step back. Lawrence asked, how did you help convince devs at your org that their app wasn't anything special and that it would work on K8s? So I think we have at DO like a pretty robust internal culture around Kubernetes. Obviously we have our own product, and then we also have an internal Kubernetes product that we use. So I think that the kind of like the going standard is Kubernetes. So that was a pretty easy sell just because that's the culture of the org. So I think if you want to move the needle on that, it seems like, I'm not sure how you would, do that from the ground up. We were just sort of norming ourselves with the rest of the org. Jimon asks, what are some good approaches for creating a video presentation? So I like the format of the munch and learn. I think I've seen that, if you kind of pick your scope really specifically, like concourse best practices, obviously that's broad, but you're probably going to hit on like 3 or 4 best practices, maybe more. Or if your topic is basics for deploying an application on Kubernetes at your company, that will also be like super scoped. So I think it's just like deciding what the topic of the video is going to be, and then kind of scoping that, and also obviously your time frame. As I highlighted here, I think the half an hour kind of munch and learn approach can be helpful within a company, just because it keeps everybody focused and it kind of creates a rigor around scope that a longer presentation sometimes doesn't have. Let's see. What methods did we use to gather information? So we actually do user research fairly robustly at DO. So in some ways we were able to capitalize on information that was already being circulated through the company via like research initiatives that were already underway. So I would say a quick way to get some research might be like an in-app a button or some other kind of like in-app interactivity, but we were also using user interviews and other kind of larger demographic research that we, already had underway when crafting that curriculum. Jason asks, what kind of timeline were you working with? Yeah, I mean, I think for the Kubernetes rollover for community, that was about a 6-month process all in. 5-6 months. And I think, with a curriculum that was probably about the same. And I think it depends on how many stakeholders that you have. So, I mean, I think, one way we were able to move the needle forward, and I was kind of leading this, was just like prototyping, testing, coming back to people with stuff already like prototyped and ready to look at. So, but yeah, I mean, I think timeline is really challenging sometimes depending on the circumstances. Yeah, Margin asks, have you had to deal with resistance to change? It's interesting. And I think like these questions are kind of, inviting me to reflect on the culture at DO. No, because people like, this is what people wanted. And so, I described that like our core team working on community were kind of like more traditional web dev, VM folks. And, but they weren't resistant because they like kind of, were situated in that broader culture. So I think it's like, if you were in a culture where people are like, this is how we've been doing it. I don't see the need. That might be a place where prototyping and then like coming back with some benchmarks might be a persuasive case, or just even doing like, industry research. And it's kind of like, where's that change coming from? As I was talking about when you were thinking about audience, it's like, if those are business decision makers, that's one kind of argument. And if it's devs, like it's another. So I think it's like deciding like, who do you need to persuade, like who's resisting? And then like, what are the arguments that are going to be most persuasive to them specifically? And then trying to think about how you could, make inroads with those arguments. Oh, interesting. I'm going to ask, about meta level concepts. Instead of, preferring explaining a concept and then going over its operational side, instead of going over all the concepts theoretically and then doing implementation later. I think that's a great approach. I mean, it definitely depends on like what your end goals are. But I love that idea and we actually do offer a Kubernetes workshop, like an introduction to Kubernetes workshop that some of my colleagues have given. And, it's the same kind of idea. In that workshop, we have a way, where we kind of explain like a pod, we explain service objects, and then we kind of do a quick demonstration or demo. So I think that's a great approach. I think if you're dealing with like a dev team where you have an objective, which is like moving an application to Kubernetes, I might kind of cram some of those things into like a kind of meta level session. But I think in a workshop setting, it's a little different. So it kind of depends on like, are you going to take your team, if you're kind of doing it like in-house with your team, are you going to take that team through, a kind of like workshop, itinerary, or are you going to like kind of keep it focused on, okay, we have this one session where we need to get everybody like up to speed on like the kind of broad level implications of what we're about to do. So it's kind of like a call on like what you are doing with your team. Let's see, did I get everything? Arsham asks, did you use the kind of golden path approach? I think, community is a fairly traditional like Rails stack. So, I think there weren't a ton of surprises there, but definitely like, there other people, working with different use cases would maybe have like a different approach to this. But for us, it was like fairly straightforward. And then also, with some, relevance to like what other Rails, apps were currently deployed at DO and like what they were doing as well. So Adam asked, did you ask to get folks certified? So the certified Kubernetes application development certificate. I think that's a great idea. We did not do that just because, for the folks who were on the team, their work was really going to be around still on the app dev side rather than the kind of deployment and operational side. I think that's an awesome idea though. And like, I would totally, if you can, like support that, that would be great. All right, I'm being told that probably just have time for one last question, but definitely happy to continue the conversation in our Slack chat as well. Awesome. So thank you, everyone, for coming. And I look forward to connecting with all of you, online, offline, all the good things. Enjoy the rest of KubeCon, folks.